Right now, something is going very wrong for Russia, and it's not being openly admitted. On paper, the front lines don't look catastrophic. There's no sudden collapse, no massive retreat dominating headlines overnight. But that's exactly what makes this situation so dangerous, because what's happening isn't loud, and it's not obvious. It's slow, controlled, and incredibly deliberate. And that's exactly why it's working. Ukraine isn't trying to overwhelm Russia with sheer force. It's doing something far more effective. It's dismantling Russia's ability to fight step by step until entire sections of the front lines stop functioning the way they're supposed to. This is not the kind of strategy you notice in a single day, but give it weeks, give it months, and suddenly the balance starts to shift. And right now, that shift is becoming impossible to ignore, because Ukraine has stopped fighting Russia the way Russia expects. Instead of meeting force with force, Ukraine is turning the battlefield itself into a problem that Russia can't solve. And once you understand how that works, you start to see why Russia's position is becoming more fragile than it appears. The biggest mistake Russia made in this war was assuming that size would decide everything. More troops, more equipment, more firepower. That was supposed to guarantee long-term pressure. And early on, that logic seemed reasonable. Large-scale offensives, constant assaults, and an expectation that Ukraine would eventually be worn down. But that's not what happened. Ukraine didn't try to match that approach. It changed the rules. Instead of competing on numbers, Ukraine focused on control, specifically control over movement. Because in modern warfare, movement is survival. If your forces can move freely, you can reinforce, resupply, and recover. If they can't, everything starts to break down. And Ukraine has turned that idea into one of the most effective strategies we've seen in the—
What Ukraine is doing right now is not about holding lines in the traditional sense. It's about shaping what happens behind those lines. Instead of focusing only on frontline clashes, Ukraine is extending its influence deeper, targeting the systems that keep Russian forces operational in the first place. Supply routes, transport corridors, command positions. These are now under constant pressure, and the effect is starting to add up. Because when those systems are disrupted, the front line doesn't collapse immediately, but it weakens. And once that weakening reaches a certain point, it becomes very difficult to reverse. This is where things get especially problematic for Russia, because this kind of pressure doesn't come from one big attack. It comes from hundreds of smaller ones. Repeated strikes, constant interruptions, ongoing disruption that never fully stops. And that creates a situation where Russian forces are not just dealing with Ukrainian attacks, they're dealing with instability inside their own operations. Supplies don't arrive when expected, units don't rotate on time, reinforcements get delayed or redirected, and every one of those problems makes the next one worse. At the center of all this is something Ukraine has leaned into heavily: precision. Not massive bombardments, not reckless advances, precision. Knowing where to apply pressure, when to apply it, and how to maximize its impact. And this is where technology has completely changed the equation, because Ukraine isn't operating blindly, it's watching constantly. Surveillance has become one of Ukraine's most powerful advantages. Not just occasional reconnaissance, but persistent, continuous awareness of what's happening across large sections of the battlefield. And that changes how decisions are made. Because when you can see movement as it happens, you don't have to guess, you don't have to wait, and you can act immediately. When that capability is used consistently, it creates a kind of invisible pressure that's very difficult to deal with.
For Russian forces, this creates a serious dilemma. Every movement carries risk. Every transport becomes a potential target. Every attempt to reinforce or resupply has to be carefully calculated, and even then, it's not guaranteed to succeed. So what happens? Movement slows down, routes change, decisions take longer, and suddenly the entire system starts losing efficiency. And here's what makes this even more effective. Ukraine isn't just disrupting movement, it's shaping behavior. When Russian units know they're being watched, they start adapting. They avoid certain areas, limit exposure, and become more cautious. But that caution comes at a cost, because the more careful you are, the slower you move. And the slower you move, the easier it becomes for your opponent to control the situation. This is how Ukraine is turning a disadvantage into an advantage. It doesn't need to outnumber Russian forces, it just needs to control how those forces operate. And right now, it's doing exactly that. But this strategy only works if it's consistent. And that's where Ukraine has been particularly effective. This isn't a one-time adjustment, it's a sustained approach. Day after day, the same pressure is applied, the same systems are targeted, and the same disruptions are created. And over time, that consistency becomes overwhelming. Now compare that to Russia's position. Russia is still capable of launching attacks, it still has resources, and it still has manpower. But capability alone isn't enough, because those capabilities depend on coordination, and coordination depends on stability. Right now, that stability is being tested, and in some areas it's starting to crack, because when supply lines are unreliable, when communication is under pressure, and when movement is constantly being disrupted, even well-equipped units begin to struggle, not because they lack strength, but because they can't use that strength effectively. Another major issue is how quickly each side can adapt. Ukraine has shown a clear willingness to adjust its approach based on what's working and what isn't. Tactics evolve, methods improve, and new solutions are tested and implemented, and that creates momentum. Russia, on the other hand, is facing a more difficult situation. Adapting a large, complex military system is not easy. Changes take time. Decisions move through layers, and by the time adjustments are made, the situation on the ground may have already shifted again. This creates a gap, not necessarily in raw power, but in flexibility. And in a conflict like this, flexibility can be just as important as strength. What we're seeing now is the result of that gap. Ukraine is shaping the battlefield faster than Russia can stabilize it, and that creates opportunities. Not massive breakthroughs, at least not immediately, but smaller gains, incremental progress, the kind of advances that don't look dramatic on a map, but become significant over time. Because once pressure builds to a certain level, things start to change. Positions that were once stable become harder to defend. Areas that were once secure become vulnerable. And once that happens, even a small push can have a much larger impact than expected. This is how momentum shifts, not through a single decisive moment, but through a series of changes that gradually alter the balance. And right now, Ukraine is driving those changes. But here's where the situation becomes even more complicated for Russia, because the pressure it's facing isn't just coming from Ukrainian actions on the battlefield, it's also coming from within its own system. And that internal strain is starting to make an already difficult situation even harder to manage. Maintaining a large-scale military operation over an extended period of time requires more than just manpower and equipment. It requires consistency, coordination, and a system that can function under constant stress. When everything is working properly, even a complex operation can hold together. But when that system is repeatedly disrupted, when logistics are unreliable, when communication is strained, and when movement is constantly under threat, the cracks begin to appear. And those cracks don't show up all at once. They start small, a delay here, a miscommunication there, a unit operating without full support for longer than expected. On their own, these issues might seem manageable, but when they happen repeatedly and across multiple areas at the same time, they begin to compound. What was once a stable structure starts to feel unstable, and the effort required to maintain it increases. This is the kind of pressure Russia's dealing with right now. Not a sudden collapse, but a growing strain that affects multiple layers of its operations. And the longer that strain continues, the more difficult it becomes to keep everything functioning the way it should. At the same time, Ukraine continues to apply pressure in a way that reinforces these problems. It's not just targeting one aspect of Russia's military, it's targeting several at once. Logistics are disrupted, movement is restricted, and coordination is challenged. Each of these factors alone would be difficult to deal with, but together they create a situation where Russia is constantly trying to manage multiple problems at the same time. And this is where Ukraine's strategy really starts to show its strength, because it's not just about creating problems, it's about creating them faster than they can be solved. Every time Russia adjusts to one issue, another one emerges. A supply route is changed, but the new route becomes risky. A position is reinforced, but the reinforcement arrives late or under pressure. A tactic is adapted, but Ukraine has already begun adjusting its own approach in response. This constant cycle makes it extremely difficult for Russia to regain stability. Another important factor is how this affects decision-making. In a stable environment, decisions can be planned, coordinated, and executed with a degree of confidence. But in an environment where conditions are constantly changing, decision-making becomes more reactive. Instead of planning ahead, commanders are forced to respond to immediate problems, often with limited information and under time pressure. That shift from proactive to reactive decision-making can have a significant impact on effectiveness, because when you're constantly reacting, you're no longer shaping the situation, you're responding to it, and that means the initiative belongs to the other side. Right now, Ukraine holds that initiative, and it's using it to steadily increase the pressure. This is also where the psychological aspect of the conflict starts to come into play. Warfare isn't just about physical capabilities, it's also about perception, confidence, and morale. When units feel supported, supplied, and coordinated, they operate differently than when they feel isolated, uncertain, and under constant threat. And this is where Ukraine's strategy really starts to show its strength, because it's not just about creating problems, it's about creating them faster than they can be solved. Every time Russia adjusts to one issue, another one emerges. A supply route is changed, but the new route becomes risky. A position is reinforced, but the reinforcement arrives late or under pressure. A tactic is adapted, but Ukraine has already begun adjusting its own approach in response. This constant cycle makes it extremely difficult for Russia to regain stability. Another important factor is how this affects decision-making. In a stable environment, decisions can be planned, coordinated, and executed with a degree of confidence. But in an environment where conditions are constantly changing, decision-making becomes more reactive. Instead of planning ahead, commanders are forced to respond to immediate problems, often with limited information and under time pressure. That shift from proactive to reactive decision-making can have a significant impact on effectiveness, because when you're constantly reacting, you're no longer shaping the situation, you're responding to it. And that means the initiative belongs to the other side. Right now, Ukraine holds that initiative, and it's using it to steadily increase the pressure. This is also where the psychological aspect of the conflict starts to come into play. Warfare isn't just about physical capabilities, it's also about perception, confidence, and morale. When units feel supported, supplied, and coordinated, they operate differently than when they feel isolated, uncertain, and under constant threat. And that creates a kind of imbalance. Effort is constantly being redirected to deal with immediate problems, which makes it harder to focus on longer-term adjustments. And without those adjustments, the underlying issues remain. This is why the situation can appear stable on the surface while still being fragile underneath. From a distance, the front lines may not look dramatically different, but the conditions behind those lines, the systems that support them, are under increasing pressure, and that pressure is what ultimately determines how sustainable those positions are. Ukraine understands this, and that's why it continues to focus on disruption, control, and precision. It's not trying to force a rapid outcome, it's creating conditions where outcomes become inevitable over time. And that's a very different approach from what we typically expect in large-scale conflicts. Instead of decisive battles, we're seeing a gradual shift. Instead of sudden breakthroughs, we're seeing sustained pressure. And instead of overwhelming force, we're seeing calculated strategic influence. This doesn't mean that large-scale changes won't happen. They can, and they often do when pressure reaches a certain point. But those changes are usually the result of everything that came before, the accumulation of smaller actions that gradually weaken one side's ability to respond. That's the phase we appear to be entering now, a phase where the groundwork has been laid, where pressure has been applied consistently, and where the effects of that pressure are becoming more visible. For Russia, this is a critical moment, because the longer these conditions persist, the harder they become to manage. Stability becomes more difficult to maintain, coordination becomes more complex, and the margin for error becomes smaller. At the same time, Ukraine is continuing to refine its approach. It's not standing still, it's adjusting, improving, and expanding what's working. And that ongoing refinement makes the strategy even more effective, because it's not just consistent, it's evolving. And in a conflict where adaptability plays such a significant role, that evolution can make a major difference. All of this points to a broader reality. This war is no longer being defined solely by who has more resources or more manpower. It's being shaped by who can use what they have more effectively, who can adapt faster, who can create and maintain pressure, and who can control the conditions under which the fighting takes place. Right now, Ukraine is demonstrating a clear ability to do those things, and Russia is facing the challenge of responding to them under increasingly difficult circumstances. That doesn't mean the outcome is certain, but it does mean that the dynamics of the conflict are changing. And those changes matter, because once momentum begins to shift, once one side gains consistent influence over how the battlefield operates, it can begin to shape not just individual engagements, but the overall direction of the war. And that's exactly what we're starting to see. A shift that isn't loud or immediate, but steady and deliberate. A shift driven by strategy, not just strength. And a shift that, if it continues, could redefine what comes next.